Um, Congratulations, Urvashi, and good morning, everyone. I'm particularly honored to be conversing with Urvashi Butalia this morning, as she's a personal feminist hero of mine, has been for a long time. Just indulge me for a minute as I explain more. I belong to that generation of women who came of age in the 1980s. And I had just entered college in 1984 when Urvashi and her colleague Ritu Menon founded Kali for Women, India's first contemporary feminist publishing house. It was a most exciting development, and those of you not familiar with publishing at that time don't know how few options we had then. And Kali, as well as later Urvashi's other baby, Zuban Books, offered a home where Indian women's voices could be heard and shared. For a young woman who thought that she might like to write as well as read other Indian women, this opened up a whole new world of possibilities. And I remember what Antoine mentioned about the Kali for Women diaries. I think I have a collection too. I still recall vividly how transforming it was when Kali for Women published Radha Kumar's History of Doing. So a personal thank you to Urvashi for helping raise a new generation of Indian women feminists with books you wrote, edited, and published so that we could dream of writing and publishing today. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll ask a few questions, and I'm hoping to open it to the audience then. I would like to start with this idea of peace because you've received this Rotary Writing for Peace Award. At this point of time in the world and also in India, we see a rise in organized violence of all kinds. Of course, we know the wars going on as well in the world, which makes you wonder why humans don't learn from history, whether it is World War II or the Holocaust or partition, on which you yourself have done some amazing research and written such a nuanced and landmark book, which you all must get, which is called The Other Side of Silence. These horrific events were less than 100 years ago, and yet we don't seem to learn. What do you make of it?
Yes, Sameera, thank you so much. Also, before I respond to your question, if I may just thank the Peace Avenue Rotary District 3141 and the Mumbai Literature Festival for honoring me with this award. You know, it's something to focus on peace at a time when the world is killing itself over different wars, and when peace itself has kind of become a dirty word. You know, you're almost scared to say it. And I do want to say one thing, which is that awards are great things. They, by their very nature, honor an individual. But it's never the work of that individual alone. And if I had not had the good fortune to be able to speak to all the women who trusted me with their stories, women like you who wanted to be published, I wouldn't be standing here or sitting here getting this award. So just a reminder that it's the front person is never the only person. So thank you for that. And yeah, you're right. Your question about the wars in the world, we know exactly we don't talk much about it in India now because of the political situation, but we're all seeing what's happening in Gaza. We're all seeing what's happening across the world. Why don't people learn? Actually, I don't think people don't learn. I think they do. I found when I was doing my work on partition that almost everyone I spoke to who had lived through horrific violence came through it with compassion, came through it with a sense that we don't ever want to see this again. Because what people wanted was just to live their ordinary lives. But I think it's not that easy because it's not up to people. That's the kind of thing, you know, we tend to think, why don't we learn, blame ourselves? It's not only up to ourselves. I think that there is a way in which, because wars are caused by states and armies need to learn how to reflect on the violence that they create and how to reflect on the vested interests that are tied into that. We have had experiments in the world. You mentioned the Holocaust. Look at what Germany did post the Holocaust in terms of self-reflection, opening up. Of course, it's gone horribly wrong now, but that's another story. Look at what South Africa did. Look at what the Latin American countries did. Look at what Sri Lanka tried to do and the contribution that women made in Sri Lanka, saying you cannot talk about peace without having women at the negotiating table. But it's not really something that only people can do. And if it was left up to people, I think everybody would just want to live their lives in peace. But that understanding isn't there because there's so many vested interests tied in. So I would ask that question differently, actually. I would say, why do our states think that their citizens are their enemies and not people who want to work with them towards creating peace? You know, why don't they listen to the voices of their citizens?
Okay. That's good. I just want to also have another supplementary question to that, actually, saying, what do you see the role of women in resisting this rise in violence and in peace building? And is it right, like we see in popular rhetoric, we always seem to dump the idea of peace building in communities on the shoulders of women. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, I think that's correct to some extent. Now, again, before I answer that serious question, I turned around to look at you and I saw that podium. And I wanted to say, I kept asking Antoine, do I need to make a speech? Do I need to make a speech? And he said, no, no, you don't need to make a speech. And I'm really glad I didn't have to make a speech, because over there, you wouldn't have seen me. It's so high, I would have been kind of just hidden behind it. So that's a peaceful response to a bit of technology that is very male-centric and needs to be redesigned. So we're not fighting, but we are critiquing. So, yes, so the thing is, it's a truism that wars are created by men, by and large fought by men, but the deep and lasting impact of those is also felt very deeply by women. You see that across the world. They have to pick up the pieces, they have to knit together the fabric of life, which is so shredded, so torn. They have to continue life. They have to often live in the absence of their men. And in some ways, wars and conflicts push them into the public world in ways that hasn't happened previously. But I think also peacemaking efforts are on the ground very much created by women. And sadly, because of the ways in which patriarchy operates in our worlds, whenever we meet at the negotiating table, women are absent, hardly ever. As I mentioned, even when Norway brokered the peace accord in Sri Lanka, a country like Norway, which has such a high gender parity index, did not think to include women. And you look at our own country and the roles that women have played in peace. So I'll give you an example from Nagaland. In Nagaland, because of so much faction fighting between the different Naga groups and the conflict they had with the Indian government, it was a group called the Naga Mothers Association that was formed, which united Naga tribes across the different tribal differences. They were set up in 1984, the same time we set up Kali. And they worked at many different things. One of them was at giving a decent burial to people who had been killed in the conflict, regardless of which community they belonged to. They created a campaign called Shed No More Blood. They walked to the border of Myanmar to be able to talk to the NSC and people there to ask them to peaceably end the conflict. They argued and campaigned to work on the drug menace. It was all the effort of the women, and there were groups of mothers, and they just united the tribes across. We have plenty of examples like this in our own country. So this is the kind of thing that women do. After a conflict, they are the ones who put life back together again. But because it is done at a low-key daily level, because they do not seek publicity and publicity does not seek them, this work doesn't get recognized. But this is the real work of peace. Not the absence of guns, as was pointed out, when the subject was being introduced, that it's not just that the guns stop firing, it's what happens to lives after.
So your own writing and research work and publishing work at Zuban has always emphasized about the importance of not hogging the microphone yourself, but to pass it on to those at the margins especially, whose voices we seldom hear, whether it be women in the Northeast or Kashmir, and who can forget the book Zuban published, Do You Remember Kunan Pushpora? And as well as you've also focused on mainstreaming the voices of different classes or castes which we don't hear from. And I'm particularly thinking of Baby Haldar's memoir. Baby Haldar being a domestic worker from Gurugram, who actually wrote a very interesting book in Bengali, and which Urvashi helped translate and publish. I think it was called Life Less Ordinary. And, so tell us what the importance it is for us to do this, passing this mic and getting those other voices, particularly the margin.
So, Sameera, this is something, theoretically as feminists, women of my generation came into the women's movement in the 70s. We were really fortunate that when we began to think about feminism, we were able to step out onto the streets and do much of the campaigning that led to certain kinds of change in India. And a lot of it started here in Maharashtra. We took our inspiration from the incidents that happened here, the way women's groups reacted here. But then when we started our publishing house, so the idea behind starting Kali was that when we would jump into action in a campaign, we knew instinctually that there was something wrong, that we were fighting a discrimination, but we had no idea of its history. We had no idea of why, for example, dowry had taken the form it had. Was it only a North Indian phenomenon? Was it only Hindu? Was it only middle class, etc., etc.? And when we started to look for literature to understand the issues we were confronting, there was nothing. It was all written by men, about men. And I know you sound like I sound like a rabid feminist saying that. I am that in my other life. I mean, in some times. But the thing is that, for example, the discipline of sociology was seen to be a complete discipline if an eminent ethnographer, sociologist went into a village, interviewed only the men, and wrote a book which seemed to be the whole truth. Women, you could never cross the threshold into the home and talk to women until women's studies opened that door in the 70s. So that was why we started. But then we realized quite soon that you can't be in a country like India and be looking at presenting women's voices, but only presenting the voices of women like yourself, like you and me who are urban, educated, etc. How do we look at India beyond the borders of language and urban cities? And that's when we began to look at marginal voices. Two things did it for me, two things changed my thinking radically. One was Baby Haldar's book. So Baby Haldar, as Sameera has mentioned, is a domestic worker. She was a domestic worker who, like millions of other Indian women, was married at the age of 12 and was a mother by the age of 13, had a terribly violent husband, didn't know what to do, became a mother to 3 children, and then one day just decided, I'm getting out of here, and left and set up her own life in Delhi. And she happened to find work in the house of a retired professor who happened to be the grandson of Prem Chand, one of India's best-known Hindi writers, who helped her to learn to read and write, and then she wrote her life. That was the book that we translated. So that book earned us the most money that any book has ever done. So to me, it's a sweet irony that a poor woman's life changed her fortunes and our fortunes. But previous to that book was a book we did, which was authored by 75 village women from Rajasthan, who brought it to us one day and said, do you want to do this book? And we'll impose 2 conditions on you. One of them is that you will never sell a copy of this book at a profit, and you will, if you sell it, or never sell a copy at profit to a village woman. You can sell it at a profit through bookshop. And the other was that all 75 of us have written this book, so you have to put all 75 names on the cover. So this thinking, this really changed the way I thought of knowledge, authorship. We did put all 75 names on the back cover, and we kept no name on the front cover. But this made me think that there is so much knowledge, so much wisdom, so much wealth in women on the ground, and then we started to publish marginalized voices. What this means is, as publishers, we are continually broke. But what this means is that we are continually happy, because it is just so wonderful to be learning from that. So that's really how this happened. It wasn't something that I knew. It was something that I learned in the course of the work.
Yeah, I think the book with Rajasthani women was Sharir Ki Jankari, right?
Jankari,
very interesting book.
And you also asked, about my work on partition. Now, there too, actually, the learnings were amazing. When you start talking to women, you, even as a feminist, you bring years of feminist experience, and the most valuable lesson to me that I learned in the feminist movement was the ways of listening, how to listen to the voices of women, how to be silent when women are speaking, how not to give in to the impulse to speak up just because you're articulate and you have the privilege to speak up. And that was what I brought to my work on partition. But what I didn't know, for example, just one example was that I went in thinking that there is a tremendous silence about women's experiences, particularly of sexual violence. And me, feminist, I'm going to go in and break this silence. And then when I started to listen to the women, and they said, we don't want you to tell our stories, not in such a way that they make us vulnerable. We have to live our lives after this. Our children don't know that we've been through sexual violence, and we don't want them to know. And that's when I began to realize the value of silence. That if somebody says, I don't want this to be known, you as a researcher have to respect it. So that whole experience of 10 years of doing that research was a learning experience for me, taught me a lot. And I brought those lessons into my publishing.
Okay. So which sort of makes this next question interesting. Someone very influential, a sitting cabinet minister, no less, recently said that patriarchy is a convenient excuse for inefficiency. It does not exist, and was not a barrier for success for women. So how do you respond to this as someone deeply entrenched in India's feminist movement?
So the lady, you're talking of Nirmala Sitharaman, of course. Why should we mince words? First of all, she has a right to her opinion, but I think the tragedy of it is that patriarchy is so insidious in our lives that it makes us complicit and partners in perpetrating itself. And it is a tragedy that a minister so highly placed did not see that, because of course she's come from privilege. So did Indira Gandhi. I mean, so did all the people she named. I think she named Sarojini Naidu, and she named Indira Gandhi, she named Aruna Asif Ali. I mean, all those people, all of those women had to fight patriarchy in one way or the other. Indira Gandhi by saying, I'm the only man in my cabinet, right? Aruna Asif Ali did not get as much importance as her husband. She had to take a secondary thing to. Sarojini Naidu did not get as much importance as she should have done. I mean, post-independence, what happened? These women did not get into the important posts that they might have got. She, Sarojini Naidu, okay, governor of UP, etc. But, just as a short segue into this, I teach a course at Ashoka University, which is called Women's Society and Changing India. And in that course, my students study a very popular course called Makers of Modern India, taught by somebody else. So when they told me this, I asked them the feminist question, which is, how many women are there in your Makers of Modern India course? The answer was 0. So you can teach a whole history of Makers of Modern India without acknowledging women. How can you say patriarchy has gone? But if you're not willing to see it, you're basically helping to strengthen its roots, and that's a tragedy.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question. I want the audience to ask actually questions. Additionally, what is the big, I've been struggling with how to frame this, but what is the big troubling feminist question of our time? I would even say the big gender question of our time. It seems as if all the gains we've made, such as in education for women, are still not enough to increase their presence in the workplace, in the formal workplace. In fact, numbers there are falling. Or the gains we've made in reproductive health, such as in birth control or abortion rights, also seem threatened, particularly in certain other parts of the world, we know. Or the rights in general for women and sexual minorities, where we have taken many strides forward, but still we have many more strides to take, many more battles to fight, for many more freedoms to negotiate. So I guess what I'm really asking is, do you feel hopeful or do you feel hopeless?
I'm always hopeful. I'm always hopeful, and I'm not actually despairing over what many people, many feminists see as not making any gains. There was a study recently done which says that at the levels at which we're going in the world, it's going to take 297 more years or something like that before we achieve gender parity. But that doesn't mean that the goal is not worth fighting for. You know, it's always shifting. But Sameera, look, we're not doing too badly on legislation. We're doing really badly on enforcement. But that doesn't take away the value of the legislation. Yes, our workforce participation rates are terrible. They have been falling. But look at the work that women do. It's just not being counted. You know, do you ever see a woman on a street hanging about? No, but you see men. Women are not sitting at tea shops and drinking chai because they're working.
I know that. I know that. Yeah. My own research.
So we're just not counting them, no? So I think that's what we have to focus on, not self-flagellate ourselves, because we fought, and every little change that we have made has been worth its weight in gold. It's important to keep fighting for that, but it's important also to keep saying it's not only up to us, it's also up to everybody else. We were just having a quick conversation yesterday, and I was pointing out to my friends that in Delhi, when I was growing up as a young woman, there were no women's toilets out on the streets, right? We noticed because we had to structure our lives around where you could find a toilet if you were out for the whole day. But did any men notice? No. Now, until they don't notice, we're not going to make any change. They have to also see that they're part of this battle. That's a very unpeace-like term. They have to also see they're part of this campaign.
Correct, yeah. Okay, fine. Okay, I'm going to open it to the audience. I can't see. Who wants to please put up your hands? And yeah. Okay.
Hello, I'm Usha Subramanian. Just a question. I've read The Other Side of Silence, and as I told you earlier, I started hearing and listening after reading that book. But I also read recently Rimli Sengupta, in her novel The Lost People's Archive, has referred to the Bengal partition as the second wound of partition, by which time, people had got so tired of taking care of the first wound. This was more or less sidelined and stepmotherly and not organized resettlement. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word stepmotherly. I mean, for a variety of reasons, because I also think stepmothers are really, seen as terrible, but they're not necessarily.
So, sorry.
But no, but I'm not making fun of just that. But I think the Bengal partition had a very different character from the Punjab partition. And I think, Usha, as we open up the study of partition, more and more becomes evident. So work on the Bengal partition, now there's a huge amount of work, which is also looking at the experience of the Namashudras and the Dalits and the continuing displacement that they faced. And similarly, we're now learning about partition in the Northeast. There's so much to do with Assam, to do with Tripura, Sylhet, even the Khasi Hills, how tribals were displaced over there. So I think that there comes a moment when certain kinds of historical explorations become possible. And that is a continuing moment. And I don't think we need to think of this is the big sister, this is the poor cousin, but just that these are histories we need to open up. Oh. So I wouldn't think of it in terms of hierarchy, although I can imagine that if you're from Bengal, you might feel that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, no other questions? Then I can see somebody raising a hand over there. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. So, big fan of both of you. Why Loiter is one of my favorite books. And Urvashi ma'am, The Other Side of Silence was a seminal work. And it's inspired me to do my research in partition literature as well. And I wanted to ask you about that. As you said, that histories are being rediscovered. And the recent work in partition by phenomenal writers like Gitanjali Shri, like Aanchal Malhotra, they are now looking at the memory of partition, because my generation of people, we've not been through the conflict, but I think we still face the effects of it. So I wanted to ask your opinion on the intergenerational trauma that the partition has created that is still being carried forward now.
Do you have a question for Sameera also? No? No, because she mentioned why loiter. So, yeah, I think, see, now all the direct survivors of partition, people who experienced it well enough to remember it, so not somebody who was just born or a few years old at that time, but somebody who actually lived through that experience, I think most of them are gone. But that doesn't mean, as you yourself have said, that the trauma is not passed down through generations. Aanchal's book definitely looks at that. Gitanjali's novel also looks at that. There's a lot more work going on in Bengal, in Bangladesh, in Punjab. People are making films, they're exploring cuisine, but they're also exploring how memories are inherited. And also raising the question to which none of us has an answer, and I don't think there are that many examples in the world. The Holocaust possibly is an example, but not such a good example, of when does it become possible to finally put that memory at rest? how many generations does it take, and does it ever go away? Or does the seed always remain somewhere to be raked up or to come up in creative expression? And we don't have an answer to that. But I think that intergenerational memory explorations are among the most interesting. And if I can recommend a book to you, it's a book we published, and that's not why I'm recommending it. It's called Inherited Memories, and it looks at intergenerational memory of 2 or 3 generations on the Bengal and Bangladesh side. You might want to look at it.
I would definitely. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Hi, Urvashi ma'am. I think you touched upon the ethics of research a little bit while speaking about silence. I would want to know your learnings in ethics as a researcher that you've sort of institutionalized in Zuban, and how has that worked for you?
Yeah, it's very important for us. So that is not actually anything. I mean, I learned it personally when I was doing my work on partition. The question came up for me repeatedly, especially when I was exploring histories of sexual violence and what happened to women. Because at first it was really, really hard to find women who were willing to speak about it, who were even willing to admit that they had lived through sexual violence. And that's the first step, because one is to admit it, the other is to find the words to articulate it, especially in a society like ours where we don't even have the words to talk about sex. So how are we going to find a vocabulary to talk about sexual violence? And then to understand women's silences, because you are, as an interviewer, you come in from an urban area, you're talking to people about a forgotten history, you carry a certain power with you. And you can actually, and people often do, shape the interview, push the person into saying things which they may, they have to live with the consequences of that afterwards. So if you've read my work, you will know that I start with my own family story and the story of my uncle, who I visited 40 years after partition, the first person in the family to go and see him in Pakistan. Now, the things he told me, I realized that if I put all of them into my book in the pursuit of some abstract notion of truth, I would probably benefit from that, but he would have to live with the consequences of that. And I decided that that's when I started thinking about the silence of the researcher. How can you respect what it is your interviewee is telling you and ensure their safety, but at the same time not lose the thing that they want to say, or the thing that you're learning from what they're telling you. So using your own voice to talk about that without making the person vulnerable. And this came up, as I said, with sexual violence, when women said, don't tell our story in such a way that we can be identified. And especially when you're exploring a living history, but even when that history's gone. So I often talk about this, that in my research I found a book which is a limited publication, only 3 or 4 copies of it exist, a government publication, which has 22,000 names in it, a district by district listing of women who were abducted and possibly raped in Pakistan. There's a counter book to it in Pakistan, which I have not been able to access. At first, as a researcher, I was really excited. I wanted to put all of that information out in the public. Then I decided, how can I make these women's memories vulnerable, even if the women themselves have gone, and I put it aside. In Zuban, the same principles operate, but it's not I who brought them in, actually. It is a lot of my younger colleagues who have worked with women on the ground and who continually come up. For example, we work in Manipur a lot. And there was a lot of pressure on us during, when the conflict started, to make statements about Manipur. And my colleagues said, we can't do this. And they talked to our colleagues in Manipur who said, please just keep quiet. Because if Zuban says something, it's going to get us into trouble. And so we have to make that choice. I think one of the things is listen to the young. You learn so much. And that's what I've tried to do, despite my gray hair, in my work. Sometimes I succeed, not always. Do we have?
Hello. This side. In the corner, yeah. First of all, congratulations for the award. I had a question, since we are discussing and talking about peace, unfortunately, we are living in a paradoxical world where we are close, but at the same time at distance. Right now, there are war going on, there are conflicts going on. And paradoxically, again, we have come to a stage we are confused between being silent and being at peace as a synonym, maybe. So, how do you define peace? And how do we cater to the idea of peace then?
Okay, so thank you for that question. I think while it's important to have an understanding or a definition of what peace means, for us to live by it, definitions are only that, they provide us certain boundaries, but actually real life is much more porous than that. So I would say that I don't define peace just as the absence of guns, but peace is the human desire and ability for us to just be able to live our lives, everyday lives, in peace and the way we want to live our lives without killing each other, without fighting with each other. And unfortunately, that seems to become more and more difficult with the kind of divisions we are seeing in our society. But continuing the dialogue across those borders, to me, also is a move towards peace.
Okay, I think that's a great moment to end because the prize was given the Rotary Writing for Peace Award. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.